Welcome to Just Business. Today on the show, why in a bastion of democracy do most of our companies run as authoritarian regimes? Should YouTube be allowed to train AI on creators' videos? And finally, how do you balance product development and customer engagement in the early days of building a company? Henry, why do all entrepreneurs want to be dictators?
Because it feels good, Drew. Feels good to have the power and the control. Crush your enemies at all costs. Exactly. I think I've been thinking a lot recently about why do we all run our companies so undemocratically? Are there
Mhm.
pros to that? Are there cons to that? But regardless of where we fall on that question, it's a fact. It's a not democracy when it comes to running a startup or a small business.
Yeah, exactly. I was writing about the weekend preparation for this episode, and something I wrote down was that I feel like the great irony of American democracy, right? On our election cycle, everyone is championing, oh, we have to refocus on democracy, all that stuff. But the great irony of American democracy is that our democratic institutions almost exist just enough to enable the growth and health of our undemocratic companies, right? This is like a whole uh, can of worms around whether or not America is a democracy or a plutocracy, right? Is the idea of being operated by a small little oligarchy of companies. Um, but yeah, I think it's a fascinating question, and I know it's really relevant too to your journey and my own to explore like alternative paths, alternative forms of corporate governments. So I'm excited to get your take on this. But the first question I have for you, Henry, this ever a other than like an academic discussion, right? Is this ever something that you felt on your journey of building a business? That there is this tension between running my company as this big powerful leader and being in control, and also I feel like I don't have enough representatives and voice from either my customers or employees.
Absolutely. I
Mhm.
think the first, like, interaction with this kind of idea comes to, "It's all on me. I'm an individual ruler of this venture,
Right.
and my responsibility to make the decisions." That pressure, I think all entrepreneurs feel to some extent, and I think from there, you can extrapolate and say, "I want more voices in the room. I want to disperse this responsibility." And so I think that's the first flirtation with this idea of maybe we should have more voices in the room. Maybe it isn't a vote,
Mhm.
but at least having more voices so it isn't just whatever I say goes, because that's lonely. And I'm not a genius. I don't have the answers to everything. And so that doesn't seem like a good path forward to just say it's all on one individual.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. That's the first thing I think of too is you start a company either as a founding team or as usually as an individual, right? And you think to yourself, this is my venture. There's a sense of like ownership and control from the get-go. And because of that, it's almost that's the framing that everything else follows from. When you find a founding team, you think to yourself, I started this, it was my idea. When you bring on your first employees, you're thinking about how do I offload the work that I do in the way that I do it, rather than thinking to yourself, oh, I really don't know how this works. I need other people to build this raft with me rather than be a part of my raft, right? And so there's this tension from the very early days of this disconnection between or deep connection and then trying to disconnect ownership and control, right? So what do you think when we start to think what are the negative outcomes of this type of thinking as we start to grow our businesses where we're focused so much on individual ownership and individual control as we're growing a business or even like still when we're early on.
Yeah. First, I would say it's one of the things that attracts me to the idea of entrepreneurship is control,
A business.
ownership and
Yeah.
control.
Mhm.
Like that is something that is unique to being on your own. But I think you asked about the negative outcomes. I think being isolated is a negative, not only from a individual emotional standpoint, but also from the idea of how am I going to succeed in the market if I'm just in my own head or if only my point of view is being, I don't know,
Represented.
realized in
Yeah.
this business? But I think to narrow down into ownership and control, as you mentioned, I think you can definitely begin to have issues with internal politics, even with a
Mhm.
small team, even with a co-founder. The idea of splitting ownership and control is something that we place a lot of emotion into and
Mhm.
can lead to a lot of relational damage within the team, which from a business standpoint, you know, impedes execution or
Yeah.
efficiency. We want things to move smoothly. And so defining exactly how control and ownership is distributed is one of the most important things, but we always overlook it, it feels. At least I do.
Yeah, exactly. I again, in preparation for this, was doing just some research into the background of like, how did we get here? How did we get to the point where this is the dominant structure that we use? And really, it goes back to the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution, when when people ran businesses, they were tradespeople that usually had studied, apprenticed with some other tradesperson. And then once quote unquote graduating from their trade school would open their own place. And so everyone was this free form entrepreneur in a sense because there were so many proprietors running businesses in all these kind of like little disparate towns and cities. Um, and then the Industrial Revolution comes along, and suddenly, because of the advent of new technologies, a lot of that power and influence can be consolidated. These businesses can get much larger, and someone almost for the first time can make money making a thing that they don't make
Yep.
just by owning the factory that produces the goods. They have some sense of ownership and control. And so there was a lot of discussion during this time about, okay, how is that going to affect the way that we run our governments and how we run these companies? And a lot of wild stuff started happening, including the advent of the modern industrial corporation, but also things like the cooperative model come out of this same time period. And so I find that interesting that the same questions that we're wrestling with, right, about like this tension between we're pro democracy and also we strive for this sense of ownership and control over our own businesses. Conversation was happening 200 years ago and has led to the outcome that has caused us to ask this question. I don't know. I find that fascinating. What do you think about that, Henry?
I love the historical context. I think that it is unique that now most entrepreneurs that aren't providing a service based off their own skill or expertise are creating a business that is selling a product or a service. Or you and I, we like software a lot, and that's what a
Mhm.
lot of our conversations are about technology. You are not instrumental in executing that product. So it is a major divorce from the historical context that really built up this idea of modern entrepreneurship or modern capitalism.
Mhm.
So it's really interesting.
Yeah. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is this, as we're wrestling with this question of should we run our companies more democratically? Spoiler alert, I believe yes. But I do want to have a discussion about where the authoritarian more model, the top down approach that we currently have, where does that work better and what are the downsides of running a company more democratically? The thing you mentioned initially that I think is super relevant is the idea of efficiency, which is a lot of the reason that this won out as well, right? In a free market economy where people have to compete, taking more time to make a decision is potentially the difference between winning out or losing a customer. And it's easier for one person to make a decision than for the collective to make a decision. So, thinking about that, thinking about efficiency and kind of this idea of collective decision making, are there any other things that you feel as an entrepreneur and as somebody who's thinking deeply about this stuff? What are the pros and cons that you see of adopting maybe a more democratic model or the praises of the kind of more traditional model of corporation?
Yeah. For me, I think it comes down to a few things. Surface level is speed and efficiency, right? If it's top down, you're going to be able to move faster and probably have a more focused vision. So if you're a founder that, sees this brighter future, it probably serves you better to have a top down approach to at least get over that first hurdle of getting to market. So I think in the short term, I would more favor a top down. I think there is a case for kind of a middle ground or within a company, and more democratic systems in place. But one of my major hangups that can get into the meat of it here is to run anything democratically requires a lot of enthusiasm and at least perceived ownership from the population that is operating the business in this case. I don't know if it's possible to apply that to all businesses. Like, how is it that the junior marketing manager at Pepsi is going to want to commit to a democratic system so that their vote actually matters and their vote is, or their opinion is equal to others? I imagine I'm getting a little bit too specific there. And I think the idea of democracy could be a little bit more broad than that. But what's your reaction?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting and goes to this question of what do we mean when we say democracy, right? I think a lot of us hear that and think of like a school project or something where everybody votes on what color the board is and like whatever that is. In reality, in a school project, there's always somebody that's a little bit like an authoritarian leader and takes control of the thing. But let's
Yeah.
disregard that for now, for the sake of argument. And I think that is right, more aligned with what we think of as direct democracy, where the decisions that need to be made are made by the collective as a whole, and basically all the decisions that need to be made are made by that collective. Now, I am not a big advocate for this strategy and do not think that it could work very well in a business environment. That might be because I don't think that it might work well in the US government, and that's colored by the fact that we don't live in a direct democracy. The people of ancient Greece might feel very differently and be really mad at me for saying all this stuff. But the whole point being the thing that we have in the US is a representative democracy, which I think could work really well in a business environment where simply the junior manager of Pepsi doesn't have to know all the intricate details of their marketing plan and their go to market strategy for this new product, right? But maybe they're allowed to vote on their manager. And that type of relationship where people have more of a sense of control and ownership over their everyday work environment, I think is really interesting and really important in terms of the long term health of a business and also like the overall retention of like employees and like staff members and the ability for more people at a company to feel a sense of ownership over the company, whether that ownership is also attached to the profits of the business, which I'm sure we'll get into. But yeah, that's my initial thoughts.
Yeah, it almost begs the question of, okay, then where's the ownership? If you have
What does
a
ownership mean?
voice,
Yeah.
yeah, if you have power in this business, then you probably own a piece of the pie. I think to tie back to one of our earlier conversations, I expressed like a hesitation around raising money.
Mm.
And it isn't because I don't want to be successful or I don't want resources to, realize my vision. It's that I don't wanna be in business to then enrich a shareholder. That it
Mhm.
just seems like you're now setting up all of your goals in order to hit a target, which in many cases I think is moving and maybe unrealistic, but now your objective once you raise money and have shareholders is to increase their return. That's not what I'm trying to do here. Like, I have no interest in doing that
Right.
as I'm setting out to build a business. I think the reason that you don't see democratic values, at least in multinational corporations or large American businesses, is because they are set up to really enrich those shareholders. So the stakeholders, the employees, and the customer base don't have a direct voice at all. I think you'd have to change both parts of that in order to shake things up. And I do want to say I agree that the idea around this, I believe, would improve retention. I'd love to see studies around that, but
Mhm.
being able to retain talented employees by giving them more of a voice over who their boss is, that sounds very appealing to me.
Totally. It's interesting that you brought up the idea of what is usually called like corporate governance, right? The
Mhm.
study of how do corporations make decisions, how are they governed by both the government and the economy, which in America we see as separate, but maybe that shouldn't be the case. But I digress. The the whole concept is that right now in our economic model, we see a shareholder and that ownership as attached to voting rights. So I think a
Yes.
lot of kind of pro modern corporation would say that there is a way that people vote. This is democratic. That that democracy just happens based on the buying and selling of shares, and in the consumer context, in whether or not people buy the product. Where this obviously breaks down is that ownership is dependent on financial capital, and the whole system of financial capital is not a very good one in terms of distributing gains equitably. And so, if we're trying to equate this corporate governance structure with being democratic, we'd have to say that everyone has equal amount of capital, which we don't, which I think is okay. The difference is just very important to make that what we're talking about when we're talking about ownership and control and voice is regardless of any other standing other than the fact that you are part of this institution and you provide value to this institution and we see that value, we're going to give you a vote in how this institution is directed. And I think that's really important and interesting. Retention aspect is cool, and there's some other stuff that I think is interesting about what you can do with representative democracies inside of companies. But before we talk through all that, I want to know from you, Henry, as you're thinking about being more of a traditional sole proprietor, you're building a business not to scale and exit. Is this a factor or a consideration for you at all in the stage that you're looking at? Do you think it helps you attract people to the mission? Do you think it helps you think through product decisions and work with customers? What do you think the benefits trade-offs are of doing this in such an early stage?
Yeah, I think implementing something like this does take extra effort, right? I want to call that out,
Totally.
right? Doing a top-down approach to starting a small business, that's the path of least resistance. Socially, historically, individually,
Legally,
profit
financially.
from that path is something that I'm curious to do. But again, the big hang up is like, what things are voted on? Is it what should the company colors be? Like, is it a branding decision? I don't know. Is it like, how are we going to market? What channels are we going to use to promote this?
Mhm.
Those types of decisions, maybe they should be put up to a vote once you have a decent group around you, that founding team.
Right.
It really depends on who the experts in the room are. I'd like to pose a hypothetical.
Please.
So, this is a challenge to democracy, and I think there's some interesting responses to it. Say a bunch of passengers get on an airplane, and
Mhm.
there's a pilot and a co-pilot, and plane takes off safely, everything's great,
Mm.
and halfway through the flight, the pilot asks the co-pilot, "What button should we press?"
Mm.
And there's 2 buttons essentially to keep the plane in the air. We don't have to say this is the end of the world and there's a crash, but just they need to make a decision, and it's important that it's gonna lead to a safe landing later on.
Yep.
They disagree on which button to press. Should they then go to the passengers and ask them and then have a vote? That's the question. Should specialized almost communities that have leadership turn to the populace for an answer to a question like that?
That's yeah, it's very interesting. I think it goes hand in hand with our conversation about direct versus representative democracies, right?
Mhm.
In this example, I think it would be borderline insane for the pilot to go over the intercom and
Yeah,
say, "Flight attendants, please count the raised hands," and all this.
yeah, it would
Like,
be nuts.
that'd be nuts. I think their slight difference, again, this is a crazy hypothetical. The passengers vote to decide who the co-pilot and the pilot are, right? That's really the where this decision gets to, right? There is
Yeah,
a pilot co-pilot relationship. The pilot is the one that takes precedence in situations where decisions need to be made, which is very similar to how we set up traditional companies and startups today, right? Keith and I, my co-founder, who I worked on a company with for about 3.5 years, we at one point were 50-50 partners. And Keith, about 3 months into running the business, came to me and said, "Hey, I've been doing some research, and I don't think it makes sense for us to be complete 50-50 partners, because in the event of a difficult decision where we're tied, we don't have a way of breaking the tie. And I advocate that we give you, Drew, 2% more. So it's a 51-49 split. And in the case of disagreements, you're the one that makes the final call." In that relationship that Keith and I built, he is essentially saying, "I want to elect you as the person to make the final decisions." The way that we had to do that was that I had to have 2% more of the company. Whereas I liked the idea of being 50-50 partners. I felt we were putting in an equal amount of effort and work, and that made more sense to me. So it's interesting that in the traditional model, you have to attach equity and ownership and percentage of profit, basically, to decision making power. The capital distribution is completely coalesced, whereas in other models, the main one we're talking about being a cooperative model where everyone has the same amount of vote, you have completely disconnected that idea. I don't know if that helps answer your hypothetical, but
It does.
basically,
No,
yeah, like representative democracy, I think, works in the idea of there are experts and there's a populace, and the populace gets to elect the experts.
yeah. I think in this hypothetical, a lot of people would say democratically, you want a educated population, right?
Hmm.
And unfortunately, the passengers of the plane have no idea how to fly a plane. So they couldn't vote because they're not even remotely qualified. But then you ask questions, okay, how do you qualify them? It gets difficult. I more so agree with your line of thinking
Hmm.
where if there are two expert leaders that are going to land this plane safely, let's vote on which one we think is more qualified,
Yeah.
right? Like
Who
it's
breaks
more
ties?
of a, yeah, who does the group have more confidence in their leadership?
Right.
So I think that makes total sense. I support it. To briefly play out exactly how it would work in a company,
Sure.
I'm on board if we just ignore the ownership model for a bit, because that gets complicated. But if we say, these now elect their managers, and maybe they have a direct vote in the C suite management.
Hmm.
Maybe it's representative, managers elect senior managers, whatever, but you have elections, and that's who leads the company. I'm okay with this. The next step is not necessarily like, how do you run marketing? How do you run operations? We'll just say those are siloed, right, into their departments as they are now. How do you decide how much to pay the managers and leaders? You vote. So,
Which I
we're
could give you a direct example of. So
please.
REI, which some of you might know as the Outdoor Gear Company, is the largest cooperative in the United States. And I think every 6 years, I think it is, they vote to elect the CEO of the company, basically. And as part of that, and there's like a big document that goes out about who all the candidates are, blah, 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 is what's the salary going to be? And should there be a salary increase for this job? Should it decrease? Whatever it is. And REI's cooperative participation is super low because they're massive and they're a consumer co-op and all these other reasons. But there was some controversy about whether or not the CEO is getting paid too much. There was some discussions about should this be taken into account in the next vote. Eventually, REI puts out a statement that's like to the effect of, in order to maintain a competitive salary and to get talent, that we need to compete in terms of the salary range of other CEOs at other private companies. And that's why this salary essentially needs to be as high as it is. And that seemed pretty good for people, and the CEO still gets paid, I think, close to $6 million a year. Yeah. So that if that answers your question,
Right.
people vote.
What I'm saying is it makes a lot of sense for people to elect their direct representatives or managers.
Mhm.
That all sounds great to me.
Yep.
But where I think the value of individuals voting comes down to those questions of, are we going to give the CEO a 20% raise or no? I feel like if we push that out to the people, it's gonna be yes, right? Like, if they all vote no, that's a bad sign. Would it ever happen? Would things ever go that bad where the will of the people is voting down these kind of decisions? Do you think it is a worthy safety net, or is it an unnecessary bureaucracy where we're gonna raise the salary regardless because we need to stay competitive in the market?
I
What do you
think
think about that?
I think the difference comes in just like in the conversations we're having in our governmental system about inequality. It's no secret anymore. Everybody, I think, has heard this thousands of times at this point, but the average difference between the bottommost worker and the topmost worker in 1970, I think, was something like 8 times the salaried employees, I should say. Now it's close to 50 times, right? That seems to be not right.
Yeah.
And so the situation you're talking about, I think, could totally happen if people inside of these companies that have a vote and like real ownership over the company and how it runs to say, actually, we're not going to let you increase your total compensation this year and awarded all of these stock options and stuff because we don't think it actually helps us as a company that much, right? And that's a conversation that could have wild implications throughout other companies that are also potentially democratically run. But this gets to the a different question that I'd love to explore, but happy to keep going down whatever
Please.
path you want to go down. But basically, in a market economy like we have set up in the United States, right now there is a competitive disadvantage to being democratically run for all of the reasons that we've mentioned, including seemingly less efficient to make decisions, which could affect your ability to compete. There's some counter arguments to that that banks on the idea that the person making the decision quickly is making the right decision. But let's say the other one being investment access to capital. So right now there's an entire infrastructure built for the private corporation to be given money externally from other potentially private corporations or private citizens, which is way harder to do right now if you run your business democratically or cooperatively. And finally, the people that currently benefit from this system have a ton of power over basically the only way that we could encourage the adoption of this model, which is through legislation. And so it feels, does it even matter? Should we even entertain this idea as entrepreneurs and founders if it's going to make us more likely to fail rather than succeed? Which I'm not sure if that's true, but that's can imagine someone thinking that. So what do you think about that, Henry?
I feel the same way.
He's like, you've
I
spoken
also
exactly
feel
how I feel.
No, that definitely resonates.
Mhm,
I take it maybe a step further or a step to the side and
mhm.
ask the question, can I run my business democratically without making a big deal about it? Does it have to be a part of my identity
Right.
to do that? I understand it's counterculture, but I don't want to be branded as this counterculture founder or company. I just want to be a normal company that's trying to serve my customers as best as I can. And we happen to have a system that we think works.
Which I
Is
think is
that possible? Can it
totally
be a
possible.
low key co op?
Yes, and I think being a low key co-op is something we need to normalize more in the world. I think like a lot of specifically platform cooperatives like tech startups that are running cooperatively, which is a new thing. Lean, I think, way too hard into the our homepage explains what a co-op is to all of our
Yeah.
customers and all these things, and maybe they don't care that much. If you're a consumer cooperative, I could see that being differently, but if you're just a worker co-op, I think it's something cool to put on your about page. But otherwise, the real benefit is going to be for your employees and for you, right? Not so much your customers at that point, and most customers at this point don't really care. So I think it's totally fine to be a low key co op. I think the trade off you make with being a low key co op is that although it opens up new opportunities in terms of how you get to run your business and feel about running your business, potentially the upsides of having this more like open, transparent company culture where anybody feels that they can make decisions, where people aren't afraid of pissing off their managers who control their employment. There's so much stuff that can benefit from this. I think if you're fine with the trade offs of potentially feeling a lack of control over the business, which again, I think we can decide is sometimes an upside, and also this trade off of how much more difficult it is in terms of just the economics of trying to get access to capital. If you're not trying to raise money, I don't think there's any reason other than time that you shouldn't consider eventually becoming a co-op. I think I completely agree with you that when you're just starting out, like do the easy thing, get a $50 LLC from your state, fill out the basic articles of incorporation, and go to town. I think as you grow, keeping this model in mind and knowing how and when to transition is something we both need to promote and teach. And I think a lot of people are doing great work in this. But also, we need to teach back to the community how this all works.
All that sounds great to me. I think that's a path that I'm open to for sure, and I think that most founders should be.
Hmm.
I think the hang up that I may have had a few years ago is I want the exit. I want the
Hmm.
payday at the end of the rainbow. And I think once you sit back and say, that's not what life is all about, that's not what this business is all about,
Nor is that
it
probable.
and
Like,
nor is it probable. I think it's the really hard thing that took me a while to get to
mm,
was like, there's so many factors outside of your control. Why focus on the most extreme case of something that is entirely outside of your control? So I think that's a hang up that I had. I feel a lot of entrepreneurs, especially in the technology space, may have, but I've moved past it, at least for now. We'll see. When the rubber hits the road, if I gain some traction with my venture and we start growing our head count, implementing something like this could be a total headache and crash the business. But I doubt it. I think this could be a very positive thing, which isn't as drastic of a shift as the current society makes it feel it is.
I
I think
totally
this
agree
is
with you.
just
And
letting the people be heard and not oppressed by a dictator that doesn't listen. Like it's not that extreme of an
it's not
idea.
rocket. And when
Yeah.
you, Henry, and other people listening want help with that, I've got some links in the description on YouTube and in whatever podcast player that you are listening to this on. Some great work from start.coop, no.com, it's just start.coop. They are an accelerator program designed to help tech companies start cooperative ventures. Greg Brodsky over there, the managing director. I'm going to eventually ask him to be on this podcast. But yeah, go check out their stuff.
We awesome. So, a drastic shift in gears. You and I, we both exist in the creator economy. We're podcasters now. We're avid fans of YouTube from a variety of angles. But there was recently a piece of content from two brothers that are pretty influential to you and I talking about how YouTube is leveraging creator data to
Hmm.
train AI models essentially on behalf of Google. What are you thinking about this?
Oh boy. We are so worried about talking on this topic for way too long, so we're gonna try to keep it tight. But basically, as a little recap, yeah, Hank Green and John Green have put out kind of two tandem videos about the reporting that's come out from Proof News and other publications that YouTube data, specifically transcripts, were being used like 174,000 videos across 48,000 channels by Anthropic, NVIDIA, Apple, Salesforce, OpenAI, all to train their AI models. And the video Hank was making is basically, if these companies are doing that, and that's against YouTube's terms of service, if Gemini is doing that, which is Google's product, Google is owned, or YouTube is owned by Google, is that right or okay for them to be able to do that for creators' videos? So basically, Gemini, Google's AI product, allowed to be trained on videos from creators who have uploaded their stuff to YouTube. And this is a big, giant can of worms. Uh, but essentially, that's the fundamental question. And this is another fundamental question about the relationship between kind of labor and corporations. Um, but Henry, like, I obviously am on the side of creators, which I know you are too. The thing that we've talked about in the past is, what is the solution to this? And Hank kind of teases up a solution in the video that I'd love for you to describe, because it's way simpler than anything that we had ever talked about.
Yeah, I think first how we got here is I agree. It is wrong for a company to essentially steal information from an information platform where they made a promise in the contract saying we're not going to sell that data or use that data, right?
Hmm. Or
That's
at least
wrong.
other companies can't. The question that the case they're trying to make is whether it's okay for us to, but
Well, when you're a conglomerate, I think the answer has to be no, right? If you're using that data to improve that platform, potentially, right? There
Mhm.
might not be harm there, but if you're an Amazon and you sell books, but you also make video games and movies and podcasts and audio players and smart home tech, you're now so wide
Yeah.
that I don't think that holds as much water to say, as long as it doesn't leave our empire, it's all good in terms of service. But I also just wanted to say, to set the table here, the valuations of AI backed companies,
Mm,
NVIDIAs of the world, the Googles of the world, there's so much hype and excitement around what AI will unlock, but it all is based around you need a ton of data to train the models. What did we expect to happen? We can make a judgment on, is it okay in this YouTube example, but obviously the promise of AI relied on the theft of so much data that is online and available in the digital world. Was there ever a path that was likely where that didn't happen? I just don't understand how we could have avoided this when the promise was we're going to train AI to do amazing things. How? You're gonna pay billions of dollars for licensing
licenses, yeah,
rights for decades of time to use this book or this YouTube video, like,
right.
that doesn't seem practical to me. So, just the idea of the promise of I feel like lands us right here 10 out of 10 times.
Yeah, exactly, and I think when we've talked about this before, we've gotten deep into the weeds about how do you make that entire process more fair and equitable. And what I find really interesting and found really great about Hank's video is, I'm sure he's thought through all that and wants to vent a lot about it as somebody who makes stuff on the internet, but instead he calls for this very, very simple thing for YouTube to do. And that's to allow users to opt out of being used in training data, and creates this relationship between YouTube and creators that is representative of something that could happen across the entire internet, right? Where individual people that host their data on another platform are allowed to decide whether or not they're used for training. This is something that, like, Reddit is like a famous example that Hank talks about in the video, but they basically, when they realized they were being scraped by OpenAI, said, no, actually, you can't do that. We're not allowing any bots to crawl any part of our website. And that was to protect what they deemed as their data, but really it was the Redditors' data. And the EU, like the EU AI Act, which is the first piece of legislation that is designed to curb some of these bad outcomes and bad systems of how we're trying to create a relationship between humans and AI is going to require companies to disclose where they get data. And so YouTube is now put in this little pressure cooker between creators, their Google's shareholders, Google itself, like all these things where there's no outcome to this, where they won't be caught either doing something that's bad for any one party. And I think that is so interesting, and that it all comes down to this single checkbox of I opt out of being used in training data. Um, I don't know. This is such like complex issue. It's a fascinating time to exist on the internet, but something I wanted to tease up for you, Henry, is a lot of this comes down to terms of service. A lot of what YouTube is saying in terms of their legalese of why they're allowed to do this is because creators agreed in the terms of service to give them an completely copyable license for all of the content uploaded for whatever use they have on the platform. Um, and I guess we're also then reckoning outside of AI with a relationship between us and terms of service. What do you think about this relationship that we've created between us and companies that is so fundamental to how we live our lives and also so weird and new and basically documents that no one reads?
Yeah, my opinion on it is pretty cut and dry at this point. I think terms of service are trash. I don't understand how they could be legally binding. I don't understand how it could be any sort of execution of justice to enforce anything in the terms of service that is against the user base because nobody reads them.
Yep.
Then they do not have informed consent. I don't even understand how you could say, even if you check a box that says, I am an adult and I am accepting the terms of service, I don't understand how that could be binding because they can put whatever they want in there.
Yeah.
And
And
yeah,
collectively
I
as a
just,
society, we all know that no one reads them. And so the
yeah.
idea of like
So why
enforcing
do
them,
it?
it's crazy.
Yeah, it just seems like this hidden protection on behalf of the company that they can just use to exploit people. And as these companies, tech backed,
Yep.
that's the context of terms of service, really, they've ballooned to such a massive influence where obviously we definitely have to have consumer rights.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
And any amount of terms of service protection for the company should be null and void. I think where it gets confusing is not necessarily like direct harm on
Mhm.
customers, because I think we have some good precedents there. But in this case of YouTube training an AI model, perhaps based off, we say data, but what we mean here is their stories, their information,
Yep.
their work, their intelligence. That
Yep.
is what is being repurposed here. If it's in the terms of service or not, what's the workaround here? Where do we pursue justice for this? Is this a case where, you know, a public defender or Supreme Court will rule and say, this doesn't feel right? There's just no precedence going into this like technological world where we're also interconnected with these tools that are in our daily lives. And yeah, we checked a box, but maybe that doesn't mean we want to be sold out. We don't want our identities to be given to advertisers.
Right.
Should we have a say? Is it just inherently, oh, you use this product called Facebook and now you're going to be given ads by all these corporations and they're going to know exactly your demographics to make you want to pay for things? I think people are starting to feel that they don't love that so much. And we're seeing more privacy legislation get passed. But it at least makes me question, what's the path forward here? How do you pursue justice when it just seems so one directional? Terms of service, yes, no, advance.
Exactly. And I think to your last point there, it's gonna take new legislation. Like it's fascinating to me that the EU is so aligned on so much that they are just like constantly basically saving our asses in terms of the repercussions of our companies, but that we still get to benefit from because they're multinational and whatever goes on the website basically goes on the website for everybody. Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how lawmakers and judges and all these people try to decide how are we going to protect online rights. We have a lot of legislation that protects us uh, in public spaces, right? And now we're having to reckon with the idea that, yeah, the places that we exist online are more like places where we live and work than they are stores. And that is like a fundamental shift that we are seeing in our both perception and like legal definition of the internet. It goes back to our conversation that we were just having about like democratic models of governance. Like you can imagine a completely alternate timeline where in the 1800s, when we were going through the Industrial Revolution, a bunch of political leaders and thinkers decided actually it makes more sense for all of our business institutions to run like our governmental institutions. And so everything is run with a sense of representative democracy. And how different this conversation would be now if all the creators on YouTube had a vote and say in some parts of how the product works or who's representing them in terms of even if they are represented inside of the company, which like there are YouTube partner reps, but there's they're not there to advocate for the actual creators. They are, but they're really there to foster a good relationship between the creators and the company.
It's
It's
like HR.
Yes, exactly, like HR, yeah, exactly, they're really there to protect the interests of the company, but, yeah, this is all so interesting and new, and I'm excited. I'm so proud, of Hank and John. I feel like I've been wanting Hank specifically to make this video for so long, and to come out and speak about this, and he did it in such an on-brand, elegant, very educated way with such a great balance between grace and complex understanding, nuance. Yeah, it was just great to see. The thing that I think is interesting in terms of founders who may be listening, we are talking about uh, companies using the work of others without compensation to create machines that can do the same work. And what we need to ask is how that is fundamentally different between AI and the work that we may be doing or the products that we're creating. All of us are learning from our customers. We're taking in information about how they're performing processes and trying to optimize that. And then usually we're trying to sell a product back to them with all of that understanding and knowledge. And in so many ways, that is so similar to what we think is so vile and wrong with YouTube training AI models on creators' videos. And so we need to reckon with how does that change the relationship that we create with our customers and know that this is a problem that is more fundamental and more agnostic of technology than we think it is.
And it could be even boiled down even more to the fact that it's all transactional. Maybe we got here because we were thinking transactionally, right? Pay me money, I give you this expertise or this product or the solution, but it's still transactional to say, I want to be fairly treated or I want my experience to be private.
Yeah.
Like those are also transactions because you can stop them, right? I think that I always like to take a step back and say, maybe this isn't as an extreme an idea as it might feel.
Yep.
And I also think the idea, specifically talking about YouTube, because I think people know it's a huge corporation, there's millions of creators on the platform. In many of these conversations, we're not talking about a problem that all millions of creators are experiencing. We're talking about the professional creators on the platform. What rights do they have? Because their needs are totally different. And
Yeah.
once you drill down on that, it makes more sense that they are qualified citizens of a platform that should have at least a right or a voice to say how they want to live on this digital platform. I think that's just an important point to call out.
Yeah, I totally agree. The point about transaction that this is a transaction of value. The creators have provided value to the platform, and the platform has to provide an equal amount of value and, as we're seeing, an equal amount of protection that they themselves as the platform get to have from a lot of these issues. Super fascinating. Great discussion. I think we did a good job keeping it short, but the people will tell us. Okay, last thing up here, Henry, is a question that I think a lot of early entrepreneurs struggle with, and is a question that I have for you as somebody that's currently going through this. How do you balance product development and customer engagement in the early days? How do you make sure you're not spending too much time inside of your cave developing your idea and an equal amount of time potentially actually bringing in customers and learning from their feedback and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, you're really calling me out here because I love cave. My cave is so warm and safe, and I'm always right in my cave. And going out into the wild is scary, right?
Yeah.
But eventually you have to. And I think this is such an important question, really, at all stages of companies, especially technology companies. I don't have a great answer for you, but I think that trying to be as transparent as possible, not only with how you're running your business, potentially building in public, but also with what your intentions are. At least for me personally, I feel like with the many ventures that I've started and failed and pivoted and have started up again, I wanna listen to other people. I wanna listen to my customers first and foremost, but defining exactly who my customer should be often becomes the hard part. If I go out and I reach, let's just say 50 potential customers and 5 of them respond, all right, the first question is, are those the 5 that I wanna help with
Mhm.
the fact that they responded? Can I help any of the other 45? That is a little bit of a hang up for me. And then what if I talk to and serve those 5 customers, but they aren't representative of that broader pool? Am I now building something for a minority that I can't sustain a business on? That's the fear, where I'm building for the wrong people. I'm listening to the wrong customers. That I think, at least for me, could be at the heart of this balance.
Yeah, totally. The I'm glad you mentioned like building in public, right? Because I think a lot of this question, right, balancing product development and customer engagement is often one that we can analyze as, well, why do they have to be different, right? Why does product development have to be a separate function from customer engagement? And to your point about making sure that you're targeting the right customer, listening to the right people, often I think the people that are engaging with you are your customer. Like we can
Yeah.
semi take that as a point that we can solid ground that we can rest on. The question of whether or not those are the people you actually want to serve is one that I think is also very important and one to question as you continue. But in terms of needing to get a group of people who are also excited about your idea to tell you where your idea is good and bad, just throwing things out into the ether and then seeing who replies is a pretty good first step. And then the challenge is making sure that after you get some either positive or negative feedback, that you actually incorporate that into the process. And I think that's where a lot of this like ebb and flow of going inside and outside of your business is like really tricky and tough. One thing that I found really helpful, and I wrote a blog post about this a few years ago, is the idea of treating product development like client work. Rather than treating your product like an art piece that you're in your cave, you're safe, like coming out into the wild and saying, "Look, I've done this thing," which obviously has so much. There's so much peril in that process. Specifically, of you have no idea if you're building the right thing or anything anybody cares about. So if you instead think about it more in a boring way. That product development is the boring part where you have to go to a client, which is your potential customer, say, "This is the thing that I think I can do for you." They green light your product development, which is how it works if you were running an agency, like a tech agency. And after that green lighting, you agree on a set of scope, you make that thing, and you incorporate feedback as you're going. And you just constantly have this relationship that you create with your customers where they get to see something you're working on and tell you whether or not they think it's good or bad, and then that's the thing that decides whether or not you make the thing, which is so much easier to say than it is to do because we get wrapped up in our own ideas. But I think it's very important for us to change our mindsets and think more that we are treating development like client work instead of like an art piece. What do you think about that, Henry?
I like it a lot. I think I often feel that vision is
Mm,
this finite resource and only one person or one amazing team can execute something that maybe a customer base has never thought of, right? They don't know the answer to their question. They haven't even asked the question yet, maybe. But this is a solution. Maybe not to derail with that, but I know that you might have some thoughts on that idea. I think executing that way of product development through the lens of like client work where you're asking for permission, you're validating and setting the scope incrementally, where you're not just building a whole lot of stuff that nobody wants in secret. It requires really good communication with the customer.
mm,
And I think I can wrap my head around how that might work in like a B2B SaaS landscape where there's a serious vested interest. The customer is paying you thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars for this package.
yeah.
They want a voice. But if I take it into Netflix, Netflix wants to add a feature. They want permission from customers. Do you think that's a do you still think that framework should apply to a platform like that? What's more customer facing or more public facing?
What's interesting, I don't think it applies, but maybe not for the reason you might think. In
Yeah.
the Netflix example, Netflix has so many customers that going and talking to individual customers about potential new features will probably provide them a lot of qualitative data in the beginning. But at that scale, really what you might want to rely on a little bit more is quantitative data, running these new features as experiments on the live product and seeing how people use them and whether or not they seem to get value out of them. The problem when you're early is you don't have that. You don't have an
Yeah.
established customer base to test against. And so treating your initial 10 customers as the be all end all, having that direct line of communication with them, I think is an incredible value that you get to have as a startup. And also is like your only path forward in terms of making sure that you are always aligned with customer needs and then flexible enough to break from them when you think maybe these customers are skewed slightly to some bias in terms of feature set, right? You never want to get in the situation where you're building 10 different products for 10 different early customers and trying to smash all of them together, right? That's the work of like a really good product manager of trying to understand what are the actual needs, how do these needs align, and what can we do to make something happen. Um, there's that quote, right? That's if I asked people what they wanted, they would give me a faster horse, right? That's supposed to
Mhm.
be our judiciousness as founders and entrepreneurs and early product managers to make sure that we're building the right thing. I often take issue with that advice because it in some ways devalues the opinions of customers, but I
Mhm.
think in general spirit, I think it's okay. But Henry,
The flaw, I just want to
yeah, go
chime
for
in
it.
on that. The flaw in that quote, which at times I have championed,
Yep, yep.
is it is only applicable to the most extreme innovative ideas. Right? Before the automobile, there was not just a cultural standard of travel by horseback, but an entire industry around the maintenance and facilitation of that form of transport.
Yeah, exactly.
So, it is inconceivable to ask a person at that time, "Oh, how can I better serve your transportation needs?"
Right.
And them to say a what? Coal-powered locomotive? Like, it just doesn't really make sense.
But in our very literate customer bases of software, it's pretty
Yeah.
easy for them to say, "I think this button should go here." Or I think
Yeah.
that this whole menu should exist in the settings. Like these things where we have common design language. We're not doing the next generation of some product vertical. We're just really trying to optimize and make sure that a workflow works for all customers. I think that's something that you can definitely incorporate customer feedback and be happy to take their ideas. Because also,
Yeah.
customers are so jazzed when they provide an idea and you build that thing. As an early company, it's one of your superpowers that you get to do that and give that type of kind of white glove experience for your early customers. So lean into it.
Yeah. I think that's a great recommendation. And I think to tie it back to AI, if you take the advice of Henry Ford and you say, don't ask anybody, just push forward and make a car,
Yep.
I'm starting to getting scared about this artificial intelligence stuff. Like maybe we slow down and we ask a few questions to a few different people, philosophers, politicians, economists, artists. Let's get some voices in the room and
Maybe even
see.
a lawyer to say, "Hey, is it legal for me to take somebody's copyrighted work and use it for training?" Like, you could ask
Yeah,
that one.
yeah, because it does feel like this is a substantial innovation, at least
Mhm.
right now. So actually, let's not listen to our guy, Henry Ford. Let's ask some questions and see what direction should we go with this and what safety rails do we need? Because as you always like to remind me, the invention of the car was a bloody, dangerous leap that required a lot of safety rails in
Yeah,
order to protect people from death.
like literal death. Yeah.
I would apply that same mentality to the advancements in AI right now.
Yeah, or whatever product you're working on. I think it's important to make sure you have a diversity of thought and advice. So often we can get put into little startup bubbles of people just focused on how you build a big thing and not how you build a good thing. So, on that note, Henry, this week we talked about, you know, democracy at work. We talked about AI and training. And finally, we talked a little bit about product development and customer engagement. To anybody watching this on YouTube, either the shorts or on the main videos, please leave a comment. We are trying to understand better how we can make this podcast a great space for us all to learn how we can build more just businesses. And like we're talking about incorporating customer feedback, we want to hear your feedback, even from the 10 people that are watching this video.
That's right. Love to hear from you, and thanks for listening.